The cottage stood quietly at the edge of the forest, resting as it had for many years. It did not demand attention. It did not shine or call out. It simply existed, steady and calm, surrounded by tall trees that had learned long ago how to be still. The wooden walls held the warmth of the day, even as night slowly settled around them. Inside, the air felt gentle and familiar, carrying the soft scent of clean wood, dried herbs, and something warm and comforting that could not quite be named. Snow White moved slowly through the cottage, her steps light and unhurried. There was nowhere else she needed to be. Nothing waiting for her beyond this quiet moment. The floor creaked softly beneath her feet, each sound familiar and reassuring. These sounds did not interrupt the silence. They belonged to it. Outside, the forest rested. The branches of the trees barely moved, and the leaves lay still, as if listening. The night air was cool but not cold, fresh and clean, drifting gently through the open window. Snow White paused near the small wooden table, placing her hands upon its smooth surface. The wood felt solid and steady beneath her palms, grounding her, reminding her that she was safe. Very safe. She took a slow breath in through her nose, allowing the cool air to fill her chest. Then she let it fall out naturally, without forcing it, without holding on. There was no rush. The day had already finished its work. The night was holding everything now. She moved toward the window and looked out at the forest, where the path disappeared gently between the trees. There was no danger there. Only depth. Only quiet. The forest was breathing slowly, in and out. Snow White turned back into the room and crossed toward the bed, where simple blankets rested neatly, waiting. She sat down slowly, allowing her body to settle, feeling the support beneath her. With each breath, her shoulders softened, her jaw relaxed, her arms grew heavier. The candle nearby flickered gently, its flame steady and calm, casting slow-moving shadows along the walls. The light did not change. It did not rush. It simply stayed. Snow White lay back carefully, allowing the bed to receive her weight fully. The mattress responded without resistance, supporting her evenly, comfortably. Outside, an owl called once, far away in the forest. Then silence returned. Deep, unbroken. The cottage rested with her, holding its shape, its warmth, its calm presence. Nothing needed to happen next. Nothing needed to be remembered. Nothing needed to be planned. Snow White listened only to her breathing now, slow and steady, rising and falling without effort. In and out. The forest remained still. The cottage remained safe. And gently, without being pushed or pulled, Snow White drifted toward sleep, carried not by dreams yet, but by quiet itself. The Quiet Village and the Queen's Mirror. In the quiet village near the forest, mornings arrived gently. The light crept slowly over rooftops and stone paths, warming windows one by one. People moved without hurry, greeting each other softly, beginning their days with calm familiarity. Snow White lived among them for a time, helping where she could, listening more than speaking, carrying a presence that felt light and kind. She moved through the village as if she belonged to its rhythm, never disturbing it, never asking for more than the moment offered. When she smiled, people felt at ease. When she spoke, her voice carried calm. Even the animals seemed to notice, lingering near her steps, unafraid. But high above the village, beyond its quiet streets, stood the castle. Its walls were tall and cold, holding shadows even during the day. Inside those walls lived the queen, a woman whose thoughts rarely rested. She watched the world carefully, measuring it, comparing it, fearing the slow passage of time more than anything else. Each morning she stood before her mirror, not hurried, not uncertain, but expectant. "Mirror," she said softly, her voice smooth and controlled. "Tell me what I wish to know." The mirror shimmered gently before answering, its surface calm and reflective. "For now," it said, "you remain admired." The queen allowed herself to breathe, balance restored, order maintained. But time does not stop for comfort. And one morning, when the queen asked again, the mirror hesitated, only briefly, but enough to be noticed. "There is another," it said slowly. "Snow White's beauty has grown beyond your own." The room grew still. The queen did not shout. She did not rush. Her expression tightened, as though something precious had slipped slightly out of reach. A quiet jealousy settled into her thoughts, cold and heavy, filling the spaces where calm once lived. Below, the village continued its gentle routine, unaware of the shift taking place above them. Snow White walked near the forest edge that day, feeling drawn to the trees, to the deeper quiet beyond the village. The air there felt different, cooler, steadier, as if the forest itself offered rest. She paused along a narrow path, listening to the distant sounds of birds and wind moving through branches. The world felt wide and still, and for a moment, everything seemed peaceful. But unseen forces had begun to move. In the castle, the queen turned away from the mirror, her thoughts carefully forming. She would not act in haste. She would wait, observe, and choose the right moment. Because some dangers do not announce themselves loudly. They arrive slowly, quietly, like a shadow stretching across a familiar room. And as Snow White stepped closer to the forest, the path ahead began to change, guiding her gently toward a place where the world would grow quieter, and her story would shift in ways she could not yet imagine. Drawn toward the forest. As the days passed, Snow White felt herself drawn more often toward the forest, not out of fear, not out of sadness, but because the forest offered something the village could not: quiet. Along the edge of the trees, the air felt cooler and cleaner, carrying the scent of earth and leaves. The sounds of the village softened there, fading gently behind her until only natural rhythms remained. Snow White walked slowly along the familiar path, her steps light against the ground. She did not rush. She allowed the moment to unfold as it wished, listening to the subtle movements around her. Birds moved gently through the branches above. A distant stream murmured somewhere deeper in the forest, its sound steady and calming. The tall trees stood close together, not threatening, but protective, as if they had been waiting. She paused often, resting her hand against the bark of an old tree, feeling its texture beneath her fingers. The forest felt alive in a quiet way, breathing slowly, holding its own calm. Each step carried her farther from the castle's shadow, farther from the queen's restless thoughts. Here, time moved differently. The minutes felt longer, softer, less demanding. Snow White followed the path as it narrowed, winding gently between trees. Light filtered down in soft patterns, shifting slowly as branches moved above. The world felt hushed, as if the forest itself was encouraging rest. She did not feel lost. She felt guided. The path curved again, leading her deeper, where the air grew cooler and the sounds fewer. Her breathing matched her pace, slow and natural, in and out, without effort. For a moment, Snow White hesitated. She turned slightly, looking back toward the direction of the village. The rooftops were no longer visible. Only trees remained. There was no fear in her heart, only a quiet understanding that something was changing. She continued forward, trusting the calm that surrounded her. The forest seemed to accept her presence, offering stillness instead of resistance. Somewhere ahead, unseen and unknown, the path would lead her to a place of shelter, a place untouched by the queen's watchful eyes, a place where the world would pause. But for now, there was only walking, only breathing, only the steady rhythm of footsteps against the earth. The forest closed gently behind her, and Snow White moved onward, unaware that this peaceful journey marked the beginning of a life far different from the one she had known. A life shaped not by fear, but by quiet resilience and kindness. The cozy cottage revealed. The forest grew quieter as Snow White continued forward. The path beneath her feet softened, covered in pine needles and fallen leaves that muted every step. Light filtered through the branches above, dimmer now, calmer, as if the day itself were settling into rest. She walked slowly, listening to the gentle hush that surrounded her. There was no sudden change, no sharp turn, only a gradual sense that the forest was opening into something new. And then she saw it. At first, it appeared only as a shape between the trees. A small structure, low and unassuming, resting quietly at the edge of a clearing. Snow White slowed her pace, her curiosity gentle rather than cautious. As she stepped closer, the shape became clearer. A cottage, small and wooden, with a sloping roof softened by time. The walls were weathered but sturdy, and the windows reflected the forest light like calm, watchful eyes. It did not feel abandoned. It felt patient. Snow White stood at the edge of the clearing, allowing herself a moment to observe. Wildflowers grew nearby, bending softly in the breeze. Moss covered the stones that lined a narrow path leading to the door. The cottage seemed to belong to the forest, not separate from it, as if it had grown there naturally, shaped by years of quiet living. She approached slowly, her steps careful but calm. When she reached the door, she rested her hand lightly against the wood. It felt solid beneath her fingers, grounding, reassuring. She knocked once, softly. No answer came. Snow White waited, listening. The forest remained still. Only the faint sound of wind moving through leaves reached her ears. She pushed the door open gently. Inside, the air was warm and welcoming. The room was simple, but cared for. A small table stood near the center, surrounded by several tiny chairs. Shelves lined the walls, holding neatly arranged tools and dishes. Everything was clean, orderly, lived in. Snow White stepped inside, closing the door behind her with care. The cottage held a quiet warmth that settled around her shoulders, easing the tension she hadn't realized she carried. She moved slowly through the space, noticing the details. 7 small beds lined one wall, each with a simple blanket folded neatly. A hearth sat nearby, its ashes still warm, as though a fire had burned not long ago. The cottage felt safe, not because it was grand or protected, but because it was humble and steady. A place built for rest, for routine, for quiet evenings. Snow White sat down gently at the table, allowing herself to pause. The journey through the forest had been long, and now her body welcomed the stillness. For the first time since leaving the village, she felt she could breathe freely. Outside, the forest continued its gentle rhythm. Inside, the cottage held her in silence, offering shelter without question. Snow White rested there, unaware that this small hidden home would soon become a place of belonging, kindness, and quiet companionship. A refuge far from the reach of the Queen's watchful eyes. The cottage's owners return. As evening settled over the forest, the light outside the cottage softened. Shadows stretched slowly between the trees, and the air cooled just enough to signal the end of the day. Inside, the cottage remained quiet, holding its gentle stillness. Snow White rested at the small wooden table, her hands folded loosely in front of her. She listened to the silence, letting it surround her without expectation. The forest felt calm, and the cottage felt steady, as though it had been waiting for her arrival. Then, from somewhere beyond the trees, faint sounds began to rise. Footsteps, light and rhythmic. Voices, low and unhurried. Snow White lifted her head slightly, listening more closely. The sounds grew clearer, approaching the clearing outside the cottage. There was laughter, soft and familiar, mixed with the steady rhythm of boots against the ground. The door opened. 7 figures stepped inside, their movements careful and curious. They were small in stature, dressed in simple clothes worn from honest work. Their faces showed surprise as they took in the sight before them. A young woman sat calmly at their table. For a moment, no one spoke. Snow White stood slowly, her movements gentle and respectful. She met their gazes without fear, her expression open and kind. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was tired and needed a place to rest." The dwarfs exchanged glances, their surprise easing into curiosity. One stepped forward, his voice cautious but not unkind. "You found our home," he said. Snow White nodded. "It's a beautiful place," she replied. Her calm presence softened the room. The dwarfs listened as she spoke, explaining her journey through the forest, her need for shelter, her gratitude for the warmth the cottage had offered. As they heard her story, their expressions changed. Concern replaced suspicion, and kindness settled where caution had been. "You may stay," one of them said at last, "but only if you promise to be careful." Snow White smiled gently. "I promise." The cottage began to feel different then, warmer, lived in. The dwarfs moved about, setting aside their tools, lighting the fire, preparing a simple meal. Snow White offered to help, moving quietly among them, fitting naturally into the rhythm of the space. They ate together that evening, sharing simple food and quiet conversation. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the forest darkened into night. Laughter drifted gently through the room, unforced and light. The cottage filled with a sense of belonging, as though its walls recognized the harmony unfolding within them. When the meal ended, the dwarfs showed Snow White where she could rest. She thanked them sincerely, her voice filled with warmth. As night deepened and the forest settled into silence, the cottage glowed softly beneath the trees, sheltering its new guest. And for the first time in a long while, Snow White felt something close to home. A gentle life in the cottage. The days that followed unfolded slowly, one gentle moment at a time. Morning light filtered softly through the trees, waking the cottage without urgency. Inside, the air remained warm and familiar, filled with the quiet comfort of routine. Snow White rose early each day, moving quietly so as not to disturb the others. She opened the windows to let in fresh forest air and listened to the birds as they greeted the morning. Their songs were light and unhurried, echoing gently through the clearing. The dwarfs welcomed her presence without question. Each had his own habits, his own rhythm, and Snow White learned them patiently. She prepared simple meals, tidied the small rooms, and tended the hearth, keeping the cottage steady and calm. There was no need for haste. Life in the cottage followed a peaceful pattern. The dwarfs left together each morning, heading toward the mountains where they worked. Snow White watched them disappear between the trees, their laughter fading slowly until the forest returned to silence. Alone during the day, Snow White cared for the cottage. She swept the floor, arranged the small beds, and spent time near the window, gazing out at the forest. The quiet did not feel empty. It felt full, as though the trees themselves were keeping her company. Sometimes she hummed softly as she worked, her voice blending with the sounds of the forest. The melody carried warmth, and even the birds seemed to pause and listen. In the afternoons, she rested. She sat near the doorway, feeling the cool shade and watching sunlight move slowly across the clearing. The hours passed gently, without demand. When evening approached, Snow White prepared supper. The fire crackled softly as she cooked, and soon the dwarfs returned, tired but content. They gathered around the table, sharing stories of their day, their voices calm and familiar. The cottage felt alive then, filled with warmth and companionship. Laughter drifted through the small rooms, and the forest outside seemed to lean closer, listening. As night settled, they rested together. The dwarfs spoke less, their energy fading with the day. Snow White listened quietly, her presence steady and comforting. Before sleep, she stepped outside for a moment, breathing in the cool night air. The stars shone faintly above the trees, and the forest rested in deep silence. Snow White returned inside, feeling safe within the cottage walls. The simple life they shared brought her peace, and for a time, the worries of the castle felt distant. But far away, beyond the forest's calm, the queen's thoughts continued to stir, unseen and unspoken, waiting for the moment when quiet life would be tested. For now, though, the cottage remained a place of warmth, kindness, and rest, holding Snow White gently as each day passed into the next. The Queen's quiet return. Far from the forest, in the high stone castle, the Queen stood once more before her mirror. The room was silent, holding its breath, as if it already knew the answer she feared. "Mirror," she said, her voice calm but tight. "Tell me the truth." The surface shimmered slowly, reflecting candlelight and shadow. "Snow White lives," the mirror replied, "hidden deep within the forest, safe among the small cottage and those who dwell there." The Queen did not move at first. She did not shout. She did not rage. Instead, her stillness hardened. A quiet resolve settled over her thoughts, cold and deliberate. If Snow White could not be reached by force, she would be reached by patience. The Queen turned away from the mirror and moved toward a small chest resting near the wall. Inside lay cloaks and fabrics worn with age, colors dulled by time. She chose one carefully, draping it over herself, transforming her reflection into something unrecognizable. Her posture bent, her movements slowed, her voice softened. When she looked again into the mirror, an old woman stared back, harmless, forgettable, easy to trust. From another shelf, the Queen selected an apple, bright, red, perfectly shaped. She worked quietly, preparing it with care, ensuring its surface gleamed invitingly while hiding its danger beneath. The apple looked no different from any other fruit, its shine catching the light gently. The Queen stepped out of the castle without ceremony, leaving behind the cold stone halls. Her path led toward the forest, where trees grew thicker and shadows lingered longer. She walked slowly, leaning on a staff, her pace measured and unthreatening. The forest accepted her presence without protest, unaware of the quiet intention she carried. Meanwhile, the cottage remained peaceful. Snow White moved gently through her morning routine, unaware of the change approaching. The dwarfs had already left for the day, their voices fading into the trees as usual. The forest seemed calm, too calm. A breeze stirred the leaves lightly, carrying distant footsteps closer, step by careful step. The Queen approached the clearing, her figure small and bent beneath the trees. From a distance, she looked tired and harmless, exactly as she intended. She reached the edge of the clearing and paused, letting the moment settle. The cottage stood ahead, warm and inviting, unaware of the visitor drawing near. With a soft knock at the door, the Queen announced her presence, her voice gentle and worn. And inside, Snow White turned toward the sound, her heart calm, unaware that the quiet life she had found was about to face its most delicate test. The apple and the deep sleep. Snow White opened the door slowly, her expression calm and welcoming. Before her stood an elderly woman, bent slightly, her face kind and tired, her voice soft as a whisper carried by the forest air. "Good day, dear," the woman said gently. "I have traveled far and hoped for a moment of rest." Snow White smiled. "Please," she replied, stepping aside. "Come in and warm yourself." The cottage felt quiet and safe, just as it always had. The forest outside remained still, listening. The old woman entered slowly, her movements careful. She glanced around the room with quiet interest, then reached into her basket and produced a single apple. It was bright red, smooth and shining, catching the light softly as she held it up. "A gift," the woman said kindly. "Fresh and sweet. Snow White hesitated, only briefly. The apple looked harmless, inviting, its surface unblemished. The woman's voice carried no urgency, no sharpness, only patience. She took the apple and thanked her. The forest seemed to pause. Snow White lifted the apple and took a small bite. At first, nothing changed. The taste was sweet, crisp. She smiled faintly, reassured. But then slowly, the world around her began to soften in an unfamiliar way. Her breath caught slightly. The room seemed to sway, just a little. Snow White reached for the table, her fingers brushing its surface as her strength faded. The apple slipped gently from her hand, rolling quietly across the floor. Her vision dimmed, not suddenly, but as though a veil were being drawn. The old woman watched silently as Snow White sank to the floor, her movements slow and unresisting. The cottage grew still again, deeper than before. Snow White's breathing became shallow, then steady. Her eyes closed softly, as if she were drifting into a sleep far deeper than any she had known. The queen straightened, her disguise no longer needed. She glanced once at the sleeping girl, her expression unreadable, then turned and left the cottage without sound. Outside, the forest remained calm. The birds did not cry out. The wind did not stir. Snow White lay motionless, held by a spell that carried her beyond waking. Her face was peaceful, untouched by fear, as though she were resting within a dream. Time passed quietly. When the dwarfs returned that evening, their voices faded as they approached the clearing. The cottage stood as it always had, warm and familiar. They entered, calling out gently. Then they saw her. Snow White lay still upon the floor, pale and unmoving. Panic filled the room briefly, then sorrow settled heavily in its place. They lifted her carefully, speaking her name, hoping for a response that did not come. The forest listened as the cottage filled with grief. And Snow White slept on, untouched by sound, by time, by the passing hours, held within a deep and silent rest. The glass rest and gentle awakening. The forest held its silence through the night. The trees stood quietly, their branches unmoving, as if guarding the small clearing where the cottage rested. Inside, the dwarfs moved slowly, their voices hushed, careful not to disturb the stillness that had settled around Snow White. They carried her gently from the cottage, step by careful step, into the forest. Moonlight filtered softly through the branches, lighting their path with a pale glow. Snow White's face remained peaceful, untouched by fear or pain, as though she were simply resting. Beneath the trees, they placed her within a clear glass coffin, crafted with care and love. The glass caught the moonlight, reflecting the quiet beauty of the forest around her. Flowers were laid nearby, their petals resting softly against the earth. The dwarfs kept watch, day after day, night after night. They spoke little. They waited patiently. The forest became a place of gentle vigil. Birds sang softly at dawn. Leaves whispered in the evening breeze. Time moved forward without urgency, allowing the quiet to remain unbroken. One day, as sunlight filtered gently through the trees, a traveler passed through the forest. He moved slowly, guided not by purpose but by curiosity, drawn toward the clearing by a sense of calm he could not explain. He stopped when he saw her. Snow White lay within the glass, as peaceful as the forest itself. The traveler felt a stillness settle in his chest. Not surprise, not urgency, only tenderness. He stepped closer, careful and respectful, as though entering a sacred space. Moved by compassion, he leaned forward and placed a gentle kiss upon her forehead. There was no force in the gesture, no demand, only kindness. And slowly, as though waking from a long and restful dream, Snow White stirred. Her breath deepened. Her fingers moved slightly. Her eyes opened, calm and clear. The forest seemed to brighten. The dwarfs gathered, their relief quiet but overwhelming. Snow White sat up gently, her movements unhurried. She looked around, recognizing the trees, the familiar faces, the peaceful clearing. The long sleep had left her untouched, her spirit as gentle as before. The queen's spell had faded, leaving only rest behind. Life returned softly, without celebration or noise. Snow White rose, supported by kind hands, and together they returned to the cottage, where warmth and safety waited. And now, the story begins to fade. The forest is quiet again. The cottage rests beneath the trees. Snow White is safe. And you, listening here, may allow your own thoughts to soften. There is nothing more to follow, nothing more to hold, only breathing, slow and steady. The night surrounds you gently, and sleep may arrive in its own time, calm and unforced. Good night.